The Year of the Black Pony by Walt Morey, Chapter 2. The hearing was held right after Pa's funeral a couple of days later. It was the only excitement the town had known in months, and the room was crowded. Ma, Ellie, and I sat in the front row. Ellie kept looking around. I don't think at 7 she knew what was going on. Judge Beam heard Frank Chase first. I'd seen Mr. Chase a number of times in town. He lived in a board and back cabin on the side road a couple of miles beyond us. He had about 30 head of cattle and raised alfalfa. Everybody said he was a good rancher and that if anybody made it homesteading, he would. I looked at him now and thought, this is the man that killed Pa. I expected him to look different somehow. He was tall and raw-boned. He looked rawhide tough. His shoulders stretched taut his old wrinkled blue coat, and his hands were wide and thick. His hair was jet black, and heavy brows gave him a perpetual scowling look. There was a sizable lump on one cheek, several long scratches, a skinned spot on his chin, and his mouth was swollen out of shape. He gave his name, though everybody knew him, and promised to tell the truth. Then the judge said, "Now, Mr. Chase, in your own words, just what happened." "I was coming back from the Hamiltons where I delivered a load of hay," he said in a low voice. "The front wheel hit a rock and broke. The axle hit the ground and tilted the wagon bed. It startled the horses, and before I could stop them, they'd pulled the wagon crossways off the road, blocking it. The road's real narrow there," he explained. "There's a steep bank on one side. The other drops almost sheer to the creek, about 20 feet below. The creek's deep and swift at that spot. I was trying to work a pole under the axle to lift it out of the dirt so the team could pull it when these fellows came along." "What fellows?" Judge Beam asked. "Why, Arlo and Oliver Grayson and Harry Fellows, Your Honor." "Go on," the judge said. "Harry Fellows seemed to be in a big hurry and he couldn't get past. I tried to explain that I'd have the road clear in a few minutes, but he wouldn't listen. He began yelling and swearing. I guess Arlo and Oliver Grayson thought it was a great joke. They kept hollering and laughing and urging him on. Next thing I knew, Harry jumped out of the buggy and began beating my team with his whip. I took the whip away and threw it in the creek." "Then what happened?" "He came at me with his fists, fighting mad. I didn't want to hit him being drunk and all, so I kept backing away and telling him to cut it out. But he just kept coming and throwing punches at me. He hit me some pretty hard ones." "What were the Graysons doing all this time?" "Sitting on their horses, cheering him on. I guess it was a good show to them." "Did they try to stop him at any time?" Chase shook his head. "They didn't even get off their horses till it was all over." "Did Harry Fellows put those marks on your face?" "He sure did. The more I tried to talk to him, the madder he seemed to get. I finally realized there was only one way out, and I hit him as hard as I could." "Where did you hit him, and with what?" "On the point of the chin with this." Chase held up his big right fist. "If he'd been sober, it'd probably knocked him down, and that'd have been the end of it." "What did happen?" "He went down all right. Then he sort of rolled around like a sack of loose grain. Maybe he was trying to get up, I don't know. Anyway, he went over the edge of the bank and rolled right down into the creek. It's deep there and fast. He yelled once that he couldn't swim, then he sank. I ran down the road almost 100 yards to where I could get to the water and where it's shallow. I waded out waist deep, and pretty soon here he came, tumbling over and over in about a foot underwater. I hauled him out and carried him ashore." "What were the Graysons doing all this time?" "I don't know. I wasn't paying any attention to them, but they weren't helping me." "Go on." "That's about all, Your Honor. The sheriff came down the bank a minute later, and we tried to revive Harry, but it wasn't any use." Sheriff Peck spoke next. He looked big and sure and confident. He explained that he'd gone into the pastime that fateful afternoon and had found Pa and the Graysons there and had ordered them out of town. They'd done quite a bit of damage in there a few months before when they went on a spree, and I could see trouble coming again. How could you see it coming, Sheriff? They were getting loud and quarrelsome with the other customers. Harry Fellows had challenged a man to a fight, but others pulled them apart. I like to nip trouble in the bud. I thought I'd done that when I told the three of them to go home. Then what happened, Sheriff? They all left town together. Fellows was in the buggy. Arlo and Oliver were on horseback. I followed behind them a few minutes later. I was going out to Mel Hanson's to see about a missing horse, and I came on the scene with the broken wagon, just as Frank Chase described it. What were the Graysons doing? As I remember, when I got there, they were just sitting on their horses, staring down the road at Frank Chase like they couldn't believe what happened. The judge next called Arlo Grayson. Arlo was short and stocky. His blonde hair was too long, and his gray eyes were so pale they seemed to have no color. There was a look of sloppy flabbiness about him. Everybody knew he was Oliver's shadow. Whatever Oliver did, Arlo followed suit. That day he was pretty subdued. He chewed his lower lip and kept glancing at his brother. With the sheriff sitting there, he didn't dare deny anything. Little by little, Judge Beam wormed out all that the sheriff and Frank Chase had testified to. He kept mumbling, "Well, yes, sorta. Yes, it was like that, I guess." Then he'd glance at the sheriff and mutter, "Yes, sir, that's how it was." It was not that easy with Oliver. He was a husky, brawling man who'd been in scrapes of one kind or another ever since he'd come to Sunrise. He wasn't intimidated by Judge Beam or the sheriff. "Sure," he admitted, his voice loud and confident. "The sheriff told us to leave town, but we wasn't causing no trouble. The sheriff got a little excited, that's all, so we left. We'd had our fun anyway." When the judge asked how Fellows reacted to the wagon and team blocking the road, Oliver said Harry asked him real civil-like to move the wagon so's he could get past with the buggy. When Chase said he couldn't, Harry got out to show him how. Chase got mad when Harry hit the horses with a buggy whip to start him. You know that kind of whip only stings a little. "Tell me about the fight," Judge Beam said. Oliver shrugged. "Just a little old fight. Wasn't much." "The lumps on Mr. Chase's face seemed to indicate that Mr. Fellows took it pretty seriously," the judge said. Oliver turned and scowled deliberately at Frank Chase. "Them little lumps and scratches ain't nothing," he said. "I've beat up men worse than that and had a drink with 'em the next day. Anyhow, there wasn't no call to hit Harry that hard with him drunk and all." "You admit he was drunk?" "Drunk, sure, but not falling down drunk, Judge. Just drunk enough so's he couldn't fight worth a lick and couldn't stand up after being hit so hard. Chase should have hit him just hard enough to stop him, not knock him down in the bank into the creek where he drowned." "How hard would you hit a man just to stop him?" Judge Beam asked. "Can't rightly say how hard," Oliver squared his shoulders and added, "but I sure could demonstrate it, Your Honor." Judge Beam just looked at Oliver. He didn't ask any more questions. The hearing was over a few minutes later. Judge Beam summed it up. "There's no question Harry Fellows precipitated the fight that brought on his death. Mr. Chase does have a certain moral responsibility for having struck him so hard. On the other hand, a man has a right to defend himself. This is simply a tragic accident that could easily have been avoided." We were outside and had got into the buggy when Frank Chase came up to us. "Mrs. Fellows," he said awkwardly, "I can't tell you how sorry I am. If I'd even dreamed anything like this might happen, I'd let Harry beat on me all day or I'd have run away. If there's anything I can do to help you and your children, I hope you'll let me know." "Thank you, Mr. Chase," said Ma formally. "What will you do now?" he asked. Ma's head came up and her shoulders squared. "Why," she said, "we'll go right on living where we are. We'll manage." She slapped Nellie with the reins and we drove off. At home, I unharnessed Nellie, turned her into the pasture, then went into the house. Ma set Ellie and me down at the table, then put her hands flat on its top and said in a crisp, businesslike voice, "Now then, it's all over. We've done our crying. We're not going around moaning and complaining about our hard lot. We've got to think about living, and to do that, we've got to be very practical about this. The good Lord helps those who help themselves, and we've got a lot of helping ourselves to do. As Pa would have said, Ma had her feet braced. She was meeting adversity head on. She wasn't giving an inch. Ellie wiped her nose and eyes and just looked at Ma. She didn't look too good yet. She wasn't quite over her bout with sore throat, and she'd done a lot of crying. We've all got to do our share to keep this household running, Ma continued. Ellie, your job will be to do dishes night and morning, set the table cleared away, see that the floor is kept swept and clean, the bed's made every morning, and keep up your schoolwork without Mother having to continually remind you. Do you understand? Ellie nodded. She began to cry again. Christopher, Ma said to me, you're the man of the family now. You've got to do the chores you did before, plus Dad's work, and keep up your school grades too. Of course, I'll help you both every way I can. We're going to take each day as it comes and do the best we can. I'm sure everything will turn out all right. Ellie started crying hard, and Ma put her arms around her to comfort her. I went out back of the barn to do my crying. It was the last time I cried over Pa's death. Spring was here. It was time to put in a garden, and this year we'd need an especially big one with so little money to buy things. We had no team or plow, so I spaded it by hand, nights and on weekends. I dragged it smooth with one section of harrow behind Nellie. Then I planted it to peas, carrots, radishes, cabbage, and a lot of corn and potatoes. Our soil was rich, and with the warm spring weather, the rows were soon showing. I spent countless hours hoeing that garden. It seemed to me we were going to spend all spring, summer, and fall accumulating food and stuff that we'd spend all winter getting rid of. The wood pile had gone down alarmingly during the winter. Now I had to cut for the summer and fall as well as for the coming winter. That meant a lot of wood. There was a boggy spot about a quarter mile from the house where Pa had cut wood before. It held scrub pine, willow, juniper, and several other good fire kinds. We had a 2-man 6-foot cross-cut saw. I could handle it alone, bucking a tree into stovewood lengths, once I had a tree on the ground, but I needed help felling it. Ma would come down and help me fell a couple, then leave me to do the rest alone. Ma was a slender woman, not built along the husky lines of many farm women. Pulling a cross-cut saw was mighty hard for her, and we had to stop to rest many times. I worked there every weekend, sawing, splitting, and hauling wood to the house, with Nellie hitched to a 1-horse cart Pa had made. I often thought of the black pony running Christmas Ridge, but I never went up to see him again. There was too much work to do. I fell into bed every night, bone-tired. My school grades suffered a little. Ellie's didn't. But then she always was a better student than I was. Those first weeks, some members of the congregation drove out several times to see how we were making out. Ma would see them coming, rush to put on a fresh apron and pat her shining black hair into place. She'd meet them at the door with a smile and cheerful words and invite them in. Grief, Ma insisted, was a private thing. You didn't burden your friends with it. They'd sit and drink tea and eat cookies Ma had made and ask her how we were managing. We're getting along fine, Ma would say, much better than I expected. You look a little thin, Mabel, a little drawn, maybe, Mrs. Adams observed. You do look a little peaked, Mrs. Wood said. I bet you're working too hard, maybe worrying too. Ma smiled. Well, I never was the draft horse type. I've always been more on racehorse lines. Reverend Jackson drove out twice. He was young, slight, and intense. The weight of his first parish bore heavily on his thin shoulders. Some of the ladies think you look a bit tired and worn, he said. I'm afraid I agree. Are you sure you're all right? Everything is going well? Reverend, Ma said, I won't say we're having it easy because we're not, but we're getting along. We're working and we're staying together. To me, that's the most important of all. Yes, he agreed, of course. On leaving, he said, if there's anything I can do to help you, I expect you to let me know. That's the main reason I'm here. I shall certainly come to you, said Ma. Later, I took a good look at Ma. Maybe she was a bit thinner, but to me she looked healthy enough. For a time, it did seem we were getting along all right. But gradually I began to realize, and I know Ma did too, that no matter how hard we worked, there was trouble ahead. We could raise plenty of hay for our milk cow Fawn, for Nellie, and for the 9 head of beef to take them through the coming winter, but How could I harvest it? The first cutting of alfalfa would be ready in a few weeks, and I needed a mowing machine and a hay rake. Pa had traded carpenter work to Sam Fletcher for the use of those tools. So I rode to Fletcher's bareback on Nellie one Saturday. Sam Fletcher was a small man with a shock of gray hair hidden under a big floppy hat and a wide, friendly grin. He had lived in the valley a long time and was the most successful rancher around. "Son," he squinted at me, "you got the muscle and know how to put a heavy roof on a shed?" "No, sir," I said. "That's what your dad traded for the use of tools, and that's what I need." I thought of the black pony and the small band of young stock that ran free and said, maybe I could take those horses out in the morning and bring them back at night. That'd save you a man. He shook his head. "You a good rider? You got a good horse?" "I've got Nellie," I said. He looked at Nellie standing half asleep. "Why, that band would run your old mare to death the first morning. Anyway, we just open the gate and they take off on their own in the morning. I send a man to drive them in at night. By then I can spare a hand. Tell you what, when I get through this fall, if there's time, I'll come help you out. I've got 1,000 head of stock to care for. That comes first, and we're mighty busy now. Of course, if you'd like to sell those 9 head of yours, I'll take them off your ma's hands for, say, $20 a head." I thanked him, got on Nellie, and rode off. I began to realize that while Pa complained a lot, he'd also done quite a bit of work around the valley, too. His working out not only got the loan of tools, but brought in badly needed cash money as well. Cash money we had to have for clothing and food that we couldn't raise, like flour, salt, beans, and such. Cash money was all important. While Ellie and I were in school during the day, Mom went to town in the buggy and tried to find work. She asked at the hotel and both restaurants. There was nothing. She heard the livery stable wanted a boy, but they wanted one who could be there 7 days a week. She considered opening a dress shop and sewing for the local women. A woman was already doing that, though, and she wasn't very busy. The whole problem was that most of these homesteaders were just as poor as we were, and some were even more ignorant of ranching. They were Eastern bank clerks, factory workers, school teachers. They'd come out here with the same dream Pa had, to get away from the drudgery of a job and work for themselves. They arrived with nothing, or very little. If they hung on for 5 years, they got title to the land. The little cash money they had went for some kind of house, an outbuilding or two, a minimum of stock and machinery, the barest staples. Whatever hiring they did was to put up buildings. That's where Pa got the cash money we needed to live. But those homesteaders had no work for a 12-year-old boy. I woke up one night, and Ma was sitting at the table frowning at a paper covered with figures. I went and sat beside her. She looked tired. She'd helped me fell a tree that day. She indicated the page of figures and said, "I've been trying to make $20 do the work of 100, and you know that arithmetic hasn't been invented yet." I didn't want to think about leaving, but I had to ask, would selling the cattle and Nellie bring us enough to take us back east or to some big city? It would take us, but it wouldn't keep us until I could find something to do. There aren't many jobs for women, you know. She looked at the figures thoughtfully. We're in a unique position. I've no folks to go to. Your father had a brother, but he never approved of me, so he certainly wouldn't help us. Anything done, we'll have to do on our own. "How much money do we have?" I asked. "About $20, but with spring and the garden coming on and the canned stuff left over from winter, we can get through the summer all right." "What about next winter and when the money's gone?" "That's the sticker. We can't let it come to that. The practical thing is to plan now so we never reach that spot." She was quiet a moment, then said, "The ideal solution would be to leave somehow." "How can we with no money?" "I don't know yet. I'm working on that." And she was. I often heard her padding quietly about the house when she thought Ellie and I were asleep. And night after night I watched through half-closed lids as she sat at the table reading the Bible. One night, about a week after our first talk, she came out after supper and helped me hoe in the garden until dark. We sat on the steps later to rest before going in. Ellie had done the dishes, finished her homework, and had gone to bed. The stars were out bright, and there was a full moon. Our land rolled away under the soft light, right up to the foot of Christmas Ridge that rose ragged and stark against the night sky. There was no breeze. It was utterly still. Ma sat with her chin in her hand, staring into the night. I sit in there at the table and try to think things through, and my mind keeps going around like a squirrel in a cage, she said. I come out here and look at this, and everything seems to straighten itself out. You figured out what we're going to do? I asked. She nodded. I haven't worked out all the details yet. Will we have to leave? Yes, we can't possibly stay here this winter. How soon will we leave? Very soon now. I'll hate to leave. So will I. She rose and looked down at me soberly. One thing I can tell you, we're going to stay together. Then she went into the house. Saturday morning, I was getting ready to milk when Ma said, when you finish milking, put a halter on Fawn and tie her to the back of the buggy. Then hitch up Nellie and bring the buggy around. We'll all change into our best clothes. We're leaving here. My heart dropped right out of my chest. You mean now? This morning? Ma gave me a straight look. This morning, Christopher. What about the cattle? What about the chickens? We can't leave them. Only for a little while, Ma said. They'll be taken care of. Ellie asked, You mean get all dressed up like going to church? That's right, honey, like going to church. Where are we going? I asked. Christopher? Her voice was sharper than I've ever heard it. I have it all worked out. You'll learn soon enough. When Ma's voice got that edge and she had that heads up, back straight, lips pressed together look, you quit asking questions. An hour later, we were ready. Ma had on her best black dress, black gloves, hat, and shawl. She also had Pa's old valise that I stowed behind the seat. When we went up the valley, Ma driving, Ellie on one side, me on the other, and Fawn plodding patiently behind. None of us talked. After a couple of miles, we turned up a lane and Ma pulled up at a cabin. I said, But Ma, she said to me in that same sharp voice, Christopher, bring the valise, Ellie, get out. We marched up to the cabin and Ma rapped sharply. After a minute, the door opened, and Frank Chase said, surprised, Why, Mrs. Fellows! May we come in? Ma asked. Of course. He stepped back, and the three of us marched in. I put the heavy valise down at my feet. This is a surprise. Mr. Chase was obviously flustered. He had about a week's growth of beard, and his black hair stood on end. He combed his fingers hastily through his hair and said, I've been meaning to get over to see you, but I've been real busy, and to tell the truth, the time sort of gets away from a man. I know, Ma said. It's spring. That's when us farmers really have to work. She drew a deep breath and said, Mr. Chase, the day of the hearing in town, you said that if there was ever anything you could do to help me and the children, to let you know. That I did, Chase said. Ma's dark head was high. Her gray eyes looked straight into his brown ones. Mr. Chase, she said coolly, whether Harry Fellows was at fault or not in that fight you two had is not the problem. He provided a roof over our heads, put clothing on our backs, and food in our stomachs. You took that away from us. That's why we're here. Now, you can take care of us.